What is that, notes or Jabber? Does this mean note taking or Jabber? You have a note taker. Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah. I have at least one.
Looking at this one.
You want to try it?
Good morning. All right, let's go ahead and get started. This is the Sacm working group. Bob, are you going to close that door over there? Move the chair. Well, since you're standing, Bob, can you get the door? Bob, the door. Thank you. Excellent. You couldn't hear me over the noise from the hall. That's about right. All right. Good morning. Welcome to the Sacm working group. This is the Notewell, which you all have seen and acknowledged when you registered. Please remember that you are at an IETF meeting. Administrative tasks. I believe we have a note taker. Do we have a Jabber scribe? Please. Groveling working group chairs is unbecoming. Thank you, Rich. All right. Our agenda for today. Yeah, your privacy screen is very effective. So our agenda for today, administrivia is first, and then we're going to have a working discussion on the vulnerability scenario, update from Hank on that work, and on terminology, and then a discussion about way forward. Any questions, comments, bashing of the agenda? No? Excellent. Oh, Hank? Is it turned on? Check the bottom of there's a little tiny switch at the bottom on the edge.
Hi, this is Hank.
It is now working.
Whistling into the mic. Just out of curiosity, Danny is not on site? Danny called. Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other agenda bashing? No? Okay, excellent. Sorry, I've already been in an hour and a half of meetings. I'm deep cleansing breath. Okay, so status. Prior to the last meeting, we had been having virtual interims. We decided this past time to try some informal working sessions. So since then, we've had 2 informal meetings on the vulnerability scenario. The vulnerability on vulnerability scenario work. The vulnerability scenario draft that went to the IESG was decided not to publish. We requested publication of it. It was decided not to publish it and put it up on the wiki. So we do have a working group wiki, and the scenario material that scenario material has been put there. There's the list of the working group docs that were recently updated, and also one that's not been adopted yet that has also been updated. There's the Get the Requirements document through the IESG. This is still in progress. It's currently being held up by me because I overwrote my Shepherd's document and I need to redo it. It's my confession for the day. So I promised Kathleen I would have it done before this meeting started, and I have failed her, but I'll get it done before the end of the week. And then the last one is, so the last one is, you can see it up there and read it for yourself. Okay. Okay. This is where you really need to have like a 10 or 15 minute break between meetings, I must say. All right, so moving on. Pardon? We're done with agenda. Yeah. Well, actually, are there any questions on the current status that we presented? Okay. All righty. This is going to be the 90-minute Dave show. 90-plus minute Dave show. It should be at the bottom.
Test. Oh. Hi, I'm Dave Waltermeyer. I'm standing in for Danny this morning. I did not write these slides, so I'm going to do my best to stumble through the material that Danny put together. I'm probably going to need the help from all of you to help participate in this conversation and to talk through these slides. Okay. I think what we're trying to do today.
Can I ask a question real quick? How many people in the room are familiar with the vulnerability assessment scenario? All right, cool. How many people in the room know what vulnerability assessment is? Hopefully more than that. Maybe. Cool. All right. Thanks.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about a number of what we're calling components that are capabilities that are interacting with each other in order to support the vulnerability assessment scenario. So we're going to talk about those components. We're going to talk about the interactions that need to occur between those components to support the vulnerability assessment scenario. We're going to talk about the various tasks that an operator may want to perform and how those tasks are supported by the components and the interaction model. We're then going to use that information to talk about how we select information elements that are needed to support those tasks. And then we're going to talk about next steps at the end. So this effort is an attempt to develop greater clarity around the architecture in Sacm and how we need to further develop the information model in order to to represent the things that are necessary to support vulnerability assessment. So these slides, I believe, are focused on a single flow of information through the assessment process. We're probably, as we're talking, we're probably going to identify some alternate flows as well. I think we want to make sure that we talk through the entirety of the single flow as part of this conversation. The diagrams, the pictures that we're presenting, the deployment scenarios that we're talking about, I think they assume that that the components are aware of each other, that they've been configured to communicate with each other. So we'd like to kind of set aside conversations about how you do that kind of bootstrapping and configuration, how components discover each other as part of this scenario. And I think with that, we're ready to move forward. So, well, the process that we're working through right now is kind of a two-step process. So the first thing that we started with was hashing out a diagram that shows the various components that we're talking about and the interactions that are needed between those components in order to support the vulnerability assessment scenario. Once we're able to to get some agreement around the diagrams, the next thing we wanted to work on was identifying what the various tasks are that occur within the diagram. And I believe what we're referring to as a task is an interaction between a component.
Yeah, I think so. It's basically that. Yeah, you've got it. I mean, let's figure out what the components are we're talking about, what needs to go between them.
And then once we're able to do that, then for each component, we can then begin to talk about, well, what information elements does that component need in order to carry out its function within the workflow. And okay, so we have 6 components that we've identified as part of this work. I could read through this, but maybe the better way to do this is have, no, can you go back to the components? Are there any questions about the components that are identified here?
Jessica Fitzgerald, McKay, NSA. What is vulnerability detection data? She asks, having co-written the original assessment draft.
Vulnerability detection data is the information required to detect a vulnerability. So I would liken it to an oval definition. There's vulnerability description information in the vulnerability assessment scenario, and then there's vulnerability detection data.
So the data comes from the endpoint you're assessing? The vulnerability detection data?
No. I would say it is like the oval definition to detect whether a vulnerability is present.
Are we assuming that we're using oval definitions, or is that just an example?
It's an example.
So what you're suggesting is it's a signature of the vulnerability that provides sufficient detail to look at what software is present or what the configurations are that are present on the device to determine if that vulnerability is present.
Right, by my read of what was the vulnerability assessment scenario draft, and is now on the wiki, yes.
Okay, so that is separate from the information that has collected from the endpoint. You'd be comparing what you find in the vulnerability detection data repository to what you find in the endpoint repository in order to determine if you have a vulnerability.
Maybe. My perception of this term is that it is imperative guidance how to collect, how to get at a specific endpoint attribute, and how to parse and process it, and now how it should be, and now how it is to be handled, but just how to acquire it. Isn't that correct? And this is the guidance how to do something, and not what exactly to do. Or is this a misconception?
Who are the authors of the vulnerability assessment scenario draft?
And one.
Yeah.
So I think we were trying to define both. I think maybe on this slide we're just talking about the what rather than the how, and the flow is later the how.
And by the what, you're talking about the what state we care about as far as determining if a vulnerability is present, versus the how, which is how do we go about collecting that state?
Collecting and doing the comparison, I would say, for the how.
I see. Okay. Any other questions on these components? All right, next. So here's the eye chart. Is there any way we can make these bigger? Even that's slightly bigger. Yeah, that's much better. I'm sorry? I think we're gonna have to make do with this. If you need this,
It's on the, you can download the slides
yeah,
from the materials page, so you can have it right in front of you.
And as we talk through it, if we need to, we can zoom in on pieces of it. Does that make sense?
yeah, I think we actually have some slides that do. Is there a pointer? Okay, so talking through these diagrams, I think the basic workflow that we're talking about here is you have this vulnerability description data repository. So this is some provider of vulnerability description data has published a vulnerability description. That contains some of the information that we were talking about before, like a description of the vulnerable conditions that need to exist in order for a vulnerability to exist. So based on that, the vulnerability, the component that's responsible for performing vulnerability assessment would be notified that new vulnerability description data is available. It would grab that new data. It would collect the necessary endpoint identification and classification information. So what we mean by classification here is it would collect information from an endpoint that would describe its characteristics, like its software load, to determine if that endpoint is a prospective target of that vulnerability or not. That's correct, right?
I believe so. I mean, the idea is basically you've got this description data coming in. So what are the class of things that you need to go look at to see if they're
Right.
effective?
And this operation is really about trying to downscope a large collection of endpoints to the ones that you actually need to focus the assessment around. So you will get that information from the endpoint repository. You do sort of pre-evaluation of that information. Based on any missing information that you don't have, you'll go out and actually collect that information. So you'll communicate with the collector, which will then communicate with the target endpoint to collect the information. That information will update the information that's in the endpoint repository. It will send a collection response back to the vulnerability assessor. And now that the vulnerability assessor has more information, it will be able to complete or reevaluate the vulnerability assessment. And at that point, it can store the results of that vulnerability assessment so that those results can be retrieved by other downstream components. So that's the basic workflow. I think what we're going to be talking through today are parts of this workflow.
Yeah, we are. There's, I believe, if I remember the deck correctly, and I remember the discussions, there's an alternate flow, because there was a question as to whether or not it's right here. So the difference is in this area. You look back up here, this collector, and then update the endpoint repository, and then collection response. Instead of doing it that way, the set of endpoints goes to the endpoint repository, which then goes to the collector. So the question during these working meetings is basically, does the vulnerability assessment assessor communicate directly with the collector, or does it ask the endpoint repository to go and find additional information? So basically use that endpoint repository as a proxy to the collector.
So are there any thoughts on that?
Jessica Fitzgerald McKay. The endpoint repository was described as more or less being a database, yes? That'd be a very rich database if it could go and then collect information for you. I think maybe, are we using the high-level boxes as sort of abstract architectural components?
More or less. I mean, these are components that were taken directly out of the assessment draft. So,
and when we wrote that, we intended it to be more conceptual. I guess I could see a strong use case for an implementation that would combine the collector and the endpoint repository into one network device, in which case I guess the two scenarios are functionally equivalent. So I don't think if we're treating them as functional components, I'm not certain we need to necessarily be that specific.
So one thing to think about, one thing that was going through my head here is that I think we want these components to be kind of decomposable, right? They should be able to perform their function on their own, absent any of the adjacent components. So if we were to treat the endpoint repository as a proxy, it couldn't actually do collection on its own. It would still have to go to the collector in order to do that collection. Which seems to me like we're actually making things more complicated than just sending, passing that information off to the collector, directly and say, here, collect this. So it might be simpler to treat the endpoint repository as a data store and to treat the collector as the collector. Yeah.
I don't disagree. There were questions during our informal sessions. So like all of this information is already out on the list and everything. So hopefully some people are aware of the conversations. But it came up for a reason. That's all.
So I believe the remainder of the slides go with the assumption that the collector is doing the collection. Is that true? So does anyone have any concerns with us, separating the functions of the data store and the collector based on what we've just talked about, having the endpoint repository be a data store and having the collector be the component that's responsible for collection? Okay, thank you. So I think next slide, please. Yeah, I think the second bullet's a little different. Okay, so can we go back to the diagram? So I think the second bullet is really about this repository here and this repository are both repositories. They're both data stores of different kinds of information. Yes.
Sorry, there's one additional bit of information. There used to be a results repository in the diagram that we took out.
And that was combined with the endpoint repository.
That was combined right with the endpoint repository. Right. So it's expected here that results, you can see store results goes into the endpoint repository. At one point we had results in a separate repository. So, I mean, we've got lots of repositories.
Right.
Are they all composed or?
Right. So we have this repository, which I think has kind of a single function, which is around vulnerability description data. But then we have this endpoint repository that stores a number of different kinds of information. It stores endpoint identification and characterization information. It stores collected posture information that is sent back from the collector, and it stores evaluation results, assessment results after the assessment is performed. So it's storing a lot of different kinds of information. Can you go back to the text slide now? Thank you. So there was some consensus in the conversation that that combining these components into a single data store is useful. It would be interesting to get. It would be nice to get some feedback from the group. Do you think this is the right decision? Do you think the components should be separated out? Are there implementations out there that are doing things in specific ways?
This is Henk. Hi, Henk Fraunhofer Institute. In general, there is no problem at all with splitting or merging components as long as they have dedicated functions that are still not split and somehow changed that can be discovered and have capabilities. So yeah, of course, that's the nature of a component. I think you can do it just as long as the workflow works. You can just put everything into one component. I mean, it literally would be strange because it would be running on the target endpoint, but in the end, you could. And so, yes, that is not a problem at all if you define the things you split accordingly, which are essentially the functions and the thing the component is supposed to do, the tasks. Yeah. So yes, no problem.
So is that, sorry, can I ask a clarifying question for you?
Yeah.
Is that for, so for the purposes of this discussion, is that an argument in favor of being more explicit about the different types of repositories that may exist?
You have to have an understanding what data goes in and out, of course. This is the capability I'm talking about. This is the function the component basically includes, or the function is inside the component. So yes, you have to be a little bit explicit what exactly you are doing. I think it has been done already by the differentiating of vulnerability data and information, I think. So two entirely different ways to express stuff. So if you just have a specific way to explain how the input and output works, then yes, no problem. If you cannot differentiate it, there will no way be to implement two different components because it would be the same. I mean, that's kind of obvious. So, so the definitions of the functions and the capabilities are a prerequisite to distinguish two components. If you cannot distinguish their functions and capabilities, they are the same component essentially. You can instance them twice, but they still would do the same work. And that's a very naive way of how to structure architecture. But it is good. It's not a bad thing. But yes, I think this is an enabler for this kind of split or even merge or hybrid.
But so if I'm hearing you correctly, you're advocating for splitting these components because by splitting them, now you have the option of implementing them individually or merging them
I'm
together.
splitting. I'm in favor of having distinct functions again that can reside in the same component. I don't care where they are, but you have to give them a different purpose. So if you build two functions that in the same that at the end do the same thing, they're for Sacm they're the same thing. And then if you put those two different functions into different components, for Sacm they're the same component type and they will do the same thing. So it is important just to highlight what actually discrete function capabilities are provided again, and then you're okay, I think. The splitting or merging. Both okay. Is this answering your question or is this adding to the confusion? Yes, sir.
Jessica Pistrom, okay. I think I understand what Hank is saying, that we keep them separate from an architectural point of view, and then your implementation may vary, right? And is that correct? Okay. So, and I think from, my very DoD-centric point of view of the world, they would be separate functions on my network. One, the vulnerability description database is going to be very externally focused. It's going to be gathering information from external sources, and I might want to have different protocol requirements on that device. I would certainly want to have different security functions on those devices. The endpoint database, I'd want to, you're putting all your eggs in that basket, so you better watch that basket, right? So yeah, I think keeping them separate would certainly enable an implementation of this on our networks easier. And then if others wish to merge them, that's not infeasible, I don't think. So I think keeping them separate is the right way to go.
Okay. All right, so now I think we're going to start talking about the various tasks that exist across the workflow. So I think these tasks are broken up into some subgroups. There's I/O tasks. There's, I think, evaluation tasks. So the first task is the collection task. So this collection task is collecting a set of endpoint attributes about a target endpoint. So in order to drive this collection, it needs the following things as input. It needs collection guidance, which describes the not which target endpoint, but the target endpoints for which attributes need to be collected. How often those attributes need to be collected. So is this a one-time ad hoc collection? Is this a reoccurring collection that happens at various intervals? Or is this a continuous collection scenario where you have something monitoring for changes and those changes are reported? Another aspect of the collection guidance then is information that is used to actually perform the collection. So what type of methodology is being used to actually conduct the collection? So based on that, the assessment system now knows it can figure out what endpoints it needs to collect the information from, when that collection must occur, and the mechanism that is to be used to actually perform the collection. So that can drive the collection task, and then the output of that task is the collection result. But I guess it would actually be the collection results, because in the case where you're doing scheduled or continuous collection, there's some reoccurrence of results being provided. So that's the idea behind a collection task. Any questions on this? Do you feel like we've got this right?
Is this granular enough? Is this actually what we would consider a task, or do we need to go a little bit deeper on things like this, like target endpoints in the first place? It says target endpoint attributes. That's good, but did we miss a step?
Jessica Fitzgerald McKay, is this all defined in the information model? Could we pull out from the information model, here are a subset of target endpoint attributes you might want to collect? Is that our goal here?
Eventually, the goal would be to figure out what actually we need, the information elements. But before we even look at attributes, we need to be able to identify the endpoints themselves. And I don't feel like we've talked about that yet. Or am I?
Is the identity just an endpoint attribute? I feel like this might be the right level for saying what one would do in a task. We're not getting down to the specifics, but I think the specifics would then be found in the information model itself.
So I think part of the motivation for this is we've been talking about things like information elements in a very abstract sense. And by talking about this as tasks and inputs and outputs, we can actually get down to a more detailed conversation about what information we're actually talking about. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I think so. At least that's something about it.
Okay. So I think that is exactly what we're trying to do here. Yes. So we've been talking about separating collection and evaluation for a while. Evaluation is the second part of assessment. So an evaluation task is responsible for comparing the endpoint attributes that have been collected from a device against a specific desired state for those endpoint attributes. And again, we want this to be data-driven, guidance-driven. So the input in the evaluation process is which target endpoint attributes to evaluate, which I guess also assumes we can identify the target endpoints that we're doing the evaluation for. That should probably be updated on this. And then any what does this mean? Any requirements? You recall?
Which one?
Endpoint
attributes to evaluate.
And any requirements. Does that mean the desired state? No, because that's on the next bullet. Yeah, that's a question. I don't know. If Danny was here, he could tell us. And then the second piece is we need to be able to know what the expected endpoint attribute values are, the values that we're actually comparing what we found with what we desire, and then the frequency for when this type of evaluation should occur. And so using this information, the evaluation can be driven, it can be performed, and evaluation results will get produced. So any question or comment on this task? So storage. So we're discovering and creating information as part of the assessment scenario. So once we create or identify that information, collect that information, we want to be able to store that information into a repository. So the types of guidance that would be used for storage is, we need to know the data that we want to store in a repository, and we need to know something about what requirements we have for how that information should be stored. Who should be able to access that information, how long we would retain it are some examples of that. Yes, Hank.
Yeah, hi, Hank again. The term access control here, I think that content authorization is a part of also, I think the sub-bullets of input are actually, bundles of functions we were just talking about. So again, and this last function is storage requirement, has the term access control in it. And I think this could be interpreted as content authorization. And I think this content authorization capability should be everywhere, should be mandatory somehow, because not every component is allowed to access guidance how to get something, because it might include the password, how to access a system, or something like that. So the access control thing is not only here. I think it is or the content authorization thing, it is permeating all of the previous tasks.
I personally think I would be stepping up to the mic right now if I was out there. And I would be saying, I think these storage requirements are actually not well aligned with the storage task, because how the component that is storing information in a repository might not know organizationally who should actually have access to that information, nor will it know how long that information is to be retained. It seems like those should be separate concerns from the aspect of storage. So I would argue that the guidance that might be used as input into a storage task would simply just be, what data are you storing and where are you storing?
Yeah, Hank again. And this, if this is a separate function, literally, it would be utilized by every other component, I guess, mostly. So if you have that, then everything has to go through that authorization process.
Medica KO. I'm just getting back up to speed with what has been done in the last year for Sacm. But one thing that I'm thinking of when you're looking at storage requirement, there's also how do you store the data, right? In terms of, do you provide integrity, do you provide confidentiality? So, I mean, we don't have to solve this explicit problem right now.
Right.
But just to say that, you're going to be, you have to make the determination about whether or not you store something in an encryption fashion, in an encrypted manner, right? So if there's passwords, I mean, usually they're hashed, right? Nobody's going to store a password somewhere in a database, just in clear text. And other information, well, they shouldn't. Okay, yes, let's be clear, they shouldn't. Yeah. So, I think it's quite okay to just put the requirements down there, right? Because we're not talking about the how. Right? Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, I think we're trying to get to the interface that we would use to store information and talk less about the specifics of how it's stored. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Next slide. So once data has been stored, now a component may want to access that information in order to maybe to perform an evaluation. So we need a query task, the ability to retrieve data that's been stored in a repository. And the input that we would need for a query is, again, we need to understand, we need to be able to formulate a query that can be sent to a specific repository and identify the specific data to retrieve. So one aspect of that might be to include requirements about is the data fresh enough? Now, I think what we mean there is we want to be temporally sensitive about the data that we're retrieving, and the query consumer needs to understand when that data was provided, and was the data created within an acceptable time frame for it to actually use that information. So I think that's what we're talking about when we say, is it fresh enough? So we probably need to be able to query data within a certain time frame, and we need to know, for any given data that's provided back, when it was originally collected or created, so that we can make this freshness determination. And the output that we'll get then is the data that was retrieved from the repository. Pretty straightforward query response. Another task that we have is
Dave, can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question about querying. This is Jessica again. And maybe it's not actually a question about querying as much as it is about collection. When I think of querying, I think of asking, you could interpret it as asking a question of the endpoint as well for a recollection of data. I know in the solutions draft that the group is considering, we have the ability to collect data continuously and also then to send queries to the endpoint to request specific information that isn't necessarily pushed, right?
Right.
So I wonder if these tasks are granular enough. Should we be capturing the idea that you might do a collect in a continuous fashion, some data points that you might be sitting on and requesting some event-driven collection of any changes to that information versus I have a specific question to ask the endpoint that I didn't get from the data push?
Yes, and you're using the term query there, but I would say that is probably covered under the collection task.
Yeah, I think it is too. This is just the slide that generated the question. Because query could be taken the other way as well, right?
Right.
So I think maybe we need to break collection down into two different subtasks, maybe?
Can we go back to the collection task slide? So how would you break down collection?
We might need to, under input, say that there are certain target endpoint attributes we wish to have data pushed if there are any changes to those attributes. And there might be other attributes that would be identified later. In terms of vulnerability assessment, there's certain things you need to know about the endpoint, right? You need to know its identity. You need to know the software it's running. Those are pretty basic and almost always included in any sort of vulnerability bulletin. However, sometimes vulnerability bulletins require more specific information. It's this endpoint type running this software only if it's configured in this manner. That might be a time you want to ask a more specific question of the endpoint.
So based on that, I mean, aren't we talking here about these are the things that we want to collect, right? This is about the frequency of when we collect. So aren't you basically saying we would have one task that would identify a set of attributes that we care a lot about, and that those must be collected continuously,
right?
Versus another task that says, oh, something we see something interesting in that initial data set. There's follow-up data that we need to collect, and we want to do that as an ad hoc.
That's right, and I think that should be specifically called out in our guidance that there are some we're going to, as a best practice recommendation, maybe. There are certain that we feel strongly should be continuously collected, and others that could be ad hoc.
Are you suggesting that we identify the specific information that be collected continuously?
I think there's a couple we could as a starting point. I think it would add a little bit more value to the people who are trying to implement this. It's just a suggestion. Others can disagree.
I'm trying to practically figure out how this is going to work. And so if I have an endpoint in my environment, and let's say the ones that I'm really concerned about these days are my mobile endpoints, then I would like to have a baseline set of information, right? It's given to somebody, and I want to know what its baseline configuration is and what software it's running and what files it has and all that. I can see myself wanting to know when anything has been modified, i.e. somebody did an upgrade, right? A file gets added, it could be malicious, right? And so I'm trying to figure out why I would want to query or what I would want to query. And wouldn't my model be more efficient if just the device is telling me when things have changed?
Yes, yeah, I think that's what we're trying to acknowledge here by this continuous collection. So the idea is that you've given some instruction to the device that you want a specific set of posture information to be monitored and reported on change, versus other sets of posture information that might not be critical to your baseline, but might be, security relevant.
But that's exactly what I'm trying to figure
at some
out,
point down the road.
because that adds complexity, right, overall, because when do you make the decision? How do you make that decision? So implementing that, right, in software or, doing analysis is just complex. So what I'm trying to figure out is from a practical perspective, what is a scenario where that would be applicable, where you want to ask for more information?
So we were talking about this at PEMIC last night. Knowing the software load, knowing what hardware you've got are two common things that are foundational knowledge that you need to know about the endpoint in order to support a number of downstream processes like configuration management, vulnerability management, which we're talking about today, as well as incident response and patch management and license management and all of the other kinds of applications where this collected information could be valuable. So if all of these business processes require knowledge about the hardware and software load of the device, why not just provide that on a continuous basis and report whenever a change occurs? And that's what you're getting at, right? Yeah.
Kent Watson, Juniper Networks. I understand this is more of an architecture document, but our presentation, but I just want to bring to this group's awareness. In the NetConf work group, there's a Yang push effort for event notifications and things like scheduled and continuous on-change pushing of data is being done there. So I'm not sure if the group is monitoring that activity currently, but if not, then please take a look at those drafts and bring the requirements to those drafts.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. I've been following that recently, and I think a few other folks have been too.
This is Jared. I think we're talking about the collection here, not the continuing monitoring aspect of things. I think it's a separate task. Here we're talking about collections, and there are number of ways the collection can be triggered. But I think if you want actually be alarmed or notified when some software changes happen, I think that can become a build on top of that. But that itself is not necessarily part of a collection task.
I think I might agree. I think maybe that is the idea of continuously monitoring certain aspects of the endpoint might be a pre-task. Maybe that wasn't captured in our flow diagram. Maybe that's something that's going on a more continuous basis and you can make use of for this assessment.
Sorry, one thing about this, just a reminder, this is the basic case through, right? So this likely does not consider continuous, like the event-driven kind of quote collection.
Yeah. Although it is actually speaking to it.
Yeah, here we're including it right there, but maybe.
I understand, but I'm just trying to remind everybody that base case, let's get through that first, and then we'll start adding everything else in that we need to. Does that make sense?
But I think what we're talking about here, not to disagree, I think I do agree, but I think what we're talking about here is, do we need a different task for monitoring, versus collection? Are they different enough in order to warrant that? And I'm not so certain I fully understand yet what the difference is between monitoring and collection. Maybe you guys could help with that.
So monitoring to me is that a user actually gets notified of an event happening and may need to take immediate actions. Collections is like some states gets updated in the repository, and you may not know something happened until you make a query request.
But I guess my question is, though, is aren't both of those cases supported by the same underlying mechanism? Like, wouldn't the original data flow from the endpoint using basically the same mechanism? And if that's the case, is there a distinction between those cases
Not
here?
Yeah, I don't know that I would explain it up there, but I don't know that I would agree with that. Like straight away, without thinking it through completely. But the same mechanism, maybe, maybe not. Like if you're going to monitor something, you might need something to do that monitoring. Whereas the mechanism of collection is just going and looking at it and then going away.
You need something to do that too.
But it may not be the same, right? Oh, sorry. You want me to repeat all that? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Will. It seems like the mechanism might be different for monitoring than for just a one-time collect.
Well, so to talk in greater detail here, I think I want you to provide me with this collected data, right? So there's the command to gather collected information and provide that back. That's one operation, right? And then there's maybe a variation on that command where you're saying, monitor this on an ongoing basis and report to me whenever it changes, or collect at this interval. So every day send me an update about this information, or every 5 minutes send me an update about this information. It seems to me like what we're talking about is there's not always a request response essentially involved in that workflow, because sometimes the request is to configure some long-running process like a schedule or a monitoring operation, right? Whereas other cases, it's directly requesting that the information be collected. And in the case where you're setting up this long-running task, like an interval or a monitoring situation, you're just getting effectively unsolicited data, back as a response. Maybe that's where the difference is. And is that necessary? Should we be representing that difference as a different task? I think that's the question.
I think it might help clarify. If we're going to be using this as any sort of input into our information model, it might be useful to clarify that we have the capability to sit on certain data elements, and then the capability also requests more information about other data elements, however you wish to define them on your network. So I think it might be clarifying if we demonstrate that one could do both. Not that they're necessarily separate. This is, again, functional. You might be using the same protocols, and that's okay. But for the same reason, we might keep our vulnerability data repository separate from our endpoint data repository. It might be worth drawing the distinction between those two tasks as well.
Glenn Wiley, VeriSign. When I look at the critical security controls from CIS, the way they usually talk about monitoring, it includes the idea that you're doing something active with that data. So it sounds, at least in that context, it's very distinct. And I'm used to hearing that language when we're doing assessments, that we have this idea of a collection, which is really just a gathering exercise and doesn't imply immediate action. And then we have monitoring, which may include collection, but it certainly implies alerting or taking some automated or human intervention is involved in that exercise. So it feels to me like if we wanted to be consistent with language that folks are used to seeing in this context, it would be good to distinguish the two.
Okay. Yeah.
Is there also, I don't know, when I'm talking about monitoring, I think I'm thinking really down there, and I'm thinking, I immediately go to eventing, right? Like, tell me when something happens so that I don't have to look at it all the time. Is that what we're talking about? Or are we talking about?
Right. I think that is what we're talking about.
Okay, then maybe that is a different.
Yeah. Although in some circles, in some government circles, when you say monitoring, that means collect information every three days or something like that, which is a whole different meaning. But I think the more practical meaning is about doing eventing, about watching for changes and being alerted when those changes occur.
Right, and I think that's why I said it might be a different mechanism, because if you're doing eventing, then usually something else is triggering that. And anyway.
Yeah. Okay, I think we need to skip back ahead to evaluation or query is where we were. I think can we move on past? Was there any additional comments on query? Because I think that's what got us started down this. No. Target endpoint characterization. So this is the thing. This is the task that actually happens potentially before any kind of collection or monitoring has occurred. This is where we're trying to continuously keep track of all of the endpoints that are participating in the Sacm system. We want to discover target endpoints, capture identifying attributes of those endpoints. We want to pre-collect some of the information that would be needed to determine if an assessment should be performed on one or more endpoints. We want to gather these characterizations so that they can be used for some early decision making in the assessment process. Now, based on the previous conversation, I think this whole monitoring conversation also speaks to this target endpoint characterization piece, because after you identify the endpoint, after you're effectively managing the collection of the endpoint, you may be getting this feed of alerts based on your monitoring capability, and that may be part of the characterization, because we were talking about knowing the software load of a device might be important information from a characterization perspective. So I think we need to think more about this slide as well in the context of monitoring too. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is Hank again. Most of the definitions are basic. Most of the text I wrote for this is in the terminology draft. I think it doesn't belong there. It is actually describing the inputs and outputs and capabilities, and how there's a big block of text. Typically, definitions are kind of concise. And when I wrote that text, I realized that it is actually something that is not belonging, that should go into the terminology, but maybe the actual information model, or where the tasks are now described, architecture probably, I don't know. So yeah, we have to find a better place for that, because that blob of text is actually too big for the terminology at the moment. And I have to then define a more concise subset of that.
So maybe you could help us update the wiki with some of that information.
There's a good definition already done. I've done it with Danny, but yeah, I added more and more to it over time, and now it's basically not the right place anymore.
But then, so once you're able to do that, the output is target endpoint characterization records. Next slide, please. Associated class, target endpoint classification. How do we differentiate this from the previous one?
That's a good question.
Yeah, the characterization is facts you file, statements you can acquire about, you can collect, and you try to build this record. But then you have the complement to that, which is the classification. So you know something how to be like printers or endpoints. And at some point, the record enables you to say, okay, I can classify this record now. I've aggregated enough information here to make sense of this record. I mean, at the very least, the record includes a MAC address we've never seen before. There's literally nothing. You cannot classify that. Maybe you have an inventory management system that says, oh, this is my printer. And then again, you're still not sure because it's a spoofable thing. So the record aggregates associated information about supposedly one distinguishable target endpoint. And therefore, due to the process of maintaining the record, it can be split and merged. Maybe you find two MAC addresses, and at some point you realize, oh, they're on the same endpoint. So merge records, for example. And the classification happens continuously. Like at some point you have the capability and have enough data to say, okay, now I know what this is. At least a subtype of something. Right. So that's a basically.
So this is kind of, you're driving new assertions or claims or whatever about the endpoint.
This is guidance. Classification. I should say profile at some point. I don't know why it doesn't say on the slide. So the thing that is the aggregate of a classification that's somehow described is guidance. It is somehow created not by collection. It is provided by people who know stuff like the CIS and who know how endpoints should look like. It's more in that direction. It's like a profile.
Okay. Yeah, next. Target endpoint discovery. So this would be the task that would come early, at probably one of the earliest points of the process, which is this is.
So I find it interesting that it's here because I think the assessment scenario punted on discovery specifically because we were hand waving so that we could focus.
Right.
And the next slide, I think, or the slide after, has a big circle that says, where does this belong?
I see. Maybe we should go there.
Okay.
So how do I read this?
I believe these are, so this box over here that's the key. And each one of these things are the different tasks. So the colored circles relate to the colored key that indicates the task.
Okay.
That's my understanding at least.
So
Do you want me to blow this up?
So this is these two are collection. Wait. No, this is a different color green. What do we need a task for this? This is something else, right?
Notify. Right.
So this is a new thing that isn't one of these.
Right.
Okay. Well, let's come back to that then. So this is the collection task. So this is where the collector is collecting information, posture information from the target endpoint. It's interesting that these circles are overlap. Both the storage and the target endpoint characterization circles overlap.
Is that because you would expect to see some computation after characteristics are collected on the endpoint repository? That would then be the characterization or the storage, the actual storage of it?
It seems to me like endpoint characterization is more of a process, and that should happen. That should happen after. Yes.
This is Bill Munyon, CIS. It sounds like, again, kind of going back to I think what Jess was saying before about the endpoint repository box there, having a lot of functional things going on with it. So it seems like this is adding another sort of functional bullet to that to perform some of that endpoint characterization. As that information is in transit back to the endpoint repository. That's how I'm interpreting the two circles around that.
Right, but if we were talking about characterization, if characterization is the process of like enriching information or gathering information, that process has to happen on one side of the arrow or another. It's not actually happening in line, is it?
Right, I would agree with that. Yeah, and I think that's again, I think why it was sort of talked about to sort of separate the functions of the endpoint repository, because again, if that's just a data store of information, then there's got to be other places where that stuff's going to happen.
Where are those other places?
No, they're not on the diagram.
What are some examples of those other places? Or are those, are what you're thinking sort of outside the scope of the Sacm domain that we're talking about?
Or outside of the scope of this particular sequence diagram. Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments? Let's see, what else? It's interesting that, all right, so this is considered a query, is the assessor is querying the endpoint repository. This is considered a query, and that's because the vulnerability assessor is querying the BDD repository. So this helps to distinguish what we mean by query versus collection. And then target endpoint classification this is where that process is occurring. It seems to me like characterization needs some kind of process, like here or something like that. It's similar to that.
Does it though?
I don't know.
I don't know. The two things that strike me is, so characterization to me is just you have attributes that are associated with a given endpoint. Those are its characteristics. I suppose you could do further inference on those characteristics to enrich the data that you have, which would be further characterization of that thing. But I don't know that we've talked about that particular kind of effort here. The other thing is, do we really need a storage task? That's kind of jumps out at me. Is like, do we really need to explicitly say, go store this?
Yeah, or is that a
because
product?
we don't
of something
care
else?
about, right.
Any thoughts on that?
So this is Jared. I think characterization to me almost sounds like some kind of analytics, right? Like, it only happens after you collected enough information so that you can do some analytics on it, or on top of that, or you have enough information you can do or abstract things or something like that. So given the sequence, I think it either happens in the storage or
Right.
after it gets into the repository.
Or it's done by some offline process. Like one of the things we talked about with characterization, I think early, was being able to relate information that we can automatically collect from the endpoint with information that may be provided by the enterprise about the endpoint. This device is intended to be a printer, and then we can we could use that as input into evaluation to determine maybe what guidance to use, or to determine if the device is acting in a way that's different than what it's
Some
supposed to.
consumers of the repository.
Yeah. And so maybe what this diagram needs from a characterization perspective is some indicator of where that organizational information is input into this process.
Strictly speaking, it's not part of the vulnerability assessment scenario. We wanted to constrain scope to that.
Right, and if we do,
then
then what is left in characterization?
I don't know if we get into that.
We need more clarity there.
Yeah.
So we need more discussion on that. So maybe we could take that question to the list.
Okay.
Any other comments or thoughts on this diagram? How are we doing time?
Maybe about 30 minutes.
Then how many do we have left? How many slides? No more slides? Okay. All right, so let's keep going. So based on this, we wanted to drive this down now to, based on these flows, what information elements are needed to support the individual flows. So this flow here is about acquiring vulnerability description data from the VDD repository so that the vulnerability assessor can use that information to perform the assessment, which then kicks off a whole bunch of processes on the right-hand side. So some information elements that are suggested that are, I guess, part of what we're calling VDD, vulnerability description data, is ingest date, which I assume is, this is the date that the VDD was provided to the repository. Date of release, this is when, ingest, by the way, assumes that there may be other sources of vulnerability data off to the left, and that data is somehow being imported into the vulnerability description data repository. One of the things we say in the vulnerability assessment scenario is that the acquisition of that vulnerability data is out of scope of this scenario. But we're acknowledging the fact that there are public and privately available sources of vulnerability data that could be used to feed the vulnerability description data repository. So I think that's what the ingest date is about. The date of release, I think, is about when that data was originally published. So in one of these sources, these upstream sources, when was that data made available? Version is what iteration of that data is identified. External vulnerability ID, this could be something like a CVE identifier. Some meaningful global identifier for the vulnerability issue. Severity score, this could be something like a CVSS score, a common vulnerability scoring system score, or some criticality measure for the vulnerability. Vulnerability description, I would assume, is maybe some human readable or machine readable description of the vulnerability. And then vulnerability remediation information is about some description of how you would go about fixing the vulnerability. addressing the vulnerability so that you're no longer vulnerable. And that could be, I guess we want that to try to be more oriented towards machine or automation, but it could be anything, right?
Yeah, possibly. Do you think vulnerability description is like really meant to be vulnerability detection? Like this?
Yeah. Well, so I was just going to go there.
Yeah.
The question is are these the right information elements that would be provided by a VDD repository, or are we missing some? We were talking about having some way of actually detecting the presence of a vulnerability on an endpoint based on the collection and monitoring that we're doing of that endpoint. And if that's the case, we need that artifact to be included here so that it can be used as input into the system. So that would be something that's definitely missing.
Yeah, this is Joe Salloway at Tableau. So is the intent here for this, with this vulnerability response, would you be making a query to get a whole list of this is what's new in my entire repository, or is it a more targeted query? Like, for example, I know I have this piece of software. Here's the identity of this component. Return me any information you have about that.
Yeah. I think organizations suffer from exploitation of old vulnerabilities as much as they do new vulnerabilities. So I think that's actually some detail that's missing in this exchange, which is, what are some of the kinds of requests for vulnerability description data that may be necessary? What's your going in perspective on what vulnerabilities need to be, assessed? How do we drive that?
Right, and also, if you can go down a path where the vulnerability assessor becomes a copy of the vulnerability VDD repository, and I don't know if that's your intent, right? So, there's probably some caching that assessor would do, but I think those are, we have them as two different entities, so you would probably want to have some, more directed queries.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's practical. That's good input. Any other comments on this? Is there? So that's an argument that there may be information listed here that isn't necessary to be conveyed to the vulnerability assessor. But that also may mean that some of the information that's listed here may be a necessary data element to use as part of a query to determine what you actually return back to the vulnerability assessor. So things like vulnerability IDs and severity scores are common data elements that are used for querying vulnerabilities that are meaningful to an organization. So that may be information that needs to be captured over here, but isn't necessarily information that's being exchanged over here. So that's something that we need to think about. Any thoughts along that line?
Roman Daily CMU, wouldn't be another kind of IE or BigQuery thing would be give me everything back related to a particular configuration I have. So
Yeah.
Give me all the things based on this OS or this patch level.
Right.
Can I make just a process point, I guess? I don't know if it's really a process point or not, but one spike through. So all these things we're talking about now are like really relevant to the overall vulnerability assessment scenario, but not necessarily to this one particular walkthrough. This one walkthrough, if I remember correctly, was basically we get a new vulnerability description information that gets translated automagically into vulnerability detection data that triggers the assessor to go get that thing and go say what's vulnerable. I understand that all this stuff is relevant. I'm just pointing out that it's slightly beyond scope for this particular discussion, which is okay if that's what we want to talk about.
I thought the point of this conversation was to identify the information elements that are needed. Right.
I just don't want to.
But how do we help us to understand how we determine how do we scope where we provide feedback then through this this single spike? Because the comments that Joe's making sounds to me like it's actually a valuable comment relative to the spike that we're actually working on. How do we differentiate that?
I don't disagree with that. It's absolutely valuable. Absolutely. I was just pointing out that the intended focus of the discussion was on the spike through, and that we're starting to get a little bit away from that. If that's where we want to go, great.
Okay. Karen?
I mean, I think we've kind of identified here that there's probably more information that we would want to exchange, and we can take that. I'd be happy to take it offline and have a discussion as to some of the use cases I'm thinking of, and we can see if those fit in. And I don't think we necessarily need to go into more detail on this particular one.
I think the reason why I'm struggling with something useful to say is the point of this exercise is to help take us back to and clear up roadblocks with the information model and the architecture. So we were having trouble scoping it down to complete that, and so we narrowed the case.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the same problem. I mean, we've been going sort of. I think we're getting closer, but so I think the point for this would be all the points are good and relevant, and if we keep in the back of our head, is this going to help us get this information model done? I don't know if that was at all useful at all.
Okay. So
I'm just struggling to see I'm struggling to see if this is actually getting us to a point where we can finish those other two documents. And
Right.
the answer may very well be yes. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just struggling with that.
I struggle with the same question as well, because I thought the point of this actually, my first question here is: do we want to have this meta conversation as part of this right now, or do we want to continue going through the slides?
I think we probably want to continue going through and finish this discussion. I think at the end, when we talk about next steps, we need to figure out the process that's outlined here, and does this process make sense for the objectives that we have? Yeah.
Okay. So I'll endeavor to finish the slides, and then we can have that conversation. Any other feedback on this?
This is Hank. The severity score is surprising me a little bit. Where does it come from?
So
it is
yeah.
predefined. It's not our concern. We just consume it, right? So it's not our
severity
concern.
here means something different than the conversation we were having.
Yeah. Okay.
earlier.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Because that would open up.
This is about like a CVSS score. So right. All right. So this is the process information. So this is the process of vulnerability assessment. So this is where the vulnerability assessor is trying to gain access to the relevant information that's been stored in the endpoint repository to do the evaluation processes that are part of vulnerability assessment. So we talked about this earlier. This is determining the set of endpoints that should be assessed. This is performing the necessary collection, getting that response, performing the evaluation, the actual assessment, and then storing the results, I think, effectively. Is there another slide that has information elements relating to this, or no? So
No, I think that
so what should we do with this
I
slide?
think
Should,
we have, like, he had things here that he was suggesting,
Uh-huh.
and I think he probably was like,
ran out of
oh,
time.
all right, what do I do here? Yeah,
So do we
ran out of time.
want to have a conversation about the information elements that need to be exchanged here? We were trying to have that conversation before, and we stopped having that conversation. I'm not sure what to do.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about how we're actually going to get this stuff done, then yeah, we should probably talk about information elements that would be required. Because this is within special, right? Or is this something that we need to take off and to like a design team or informal meetings, because this isn't the proper venue to talk about these things, and trying to,
Yeah.
you know,
So I can give my thoughts on
Right.
what would be useful here. Roman.
So Roman, Dinity speaking, I mean, I'd recommend taking it offline. I mean, the idea that we're going to crowdsource, the individual elements and that's going to be a complete list might not be so productive. Maybe we could seed a list on the mailing list and pile on.
Yeah, I would think that would be useful, and maybe trying to focus on what's the minimal set of things that we would need to support these exchanges. Probably
Definitely
something-
+1 on enumerate the list, what it is and what's minimal viable, what's optional would be awesome.
Right. The reason why I suggested minimal is if we try to be exhaustive, we're going to be at it for a long time. Yeah. Okay, so let's take this to the list. How should we start that conversation? Should we pose this? Should someone take responsibility for posing this as a question to the list? How do the chairs want to organize this effort?
Well, yes, somebody needs to pose the question to the list. So who would you consider the key leader of this type of work? And maybe that would be a person to do it. I mean, I'm not going to pose a question to the list.
We should probably circle back with Danny after the meeting. I'm not certain how to answer that question because I'm kind of a stand-in on this.
Yeah,
Dave, I'll volunteer to post the question to the list.
Okay,
thank you.
that makes it easy. Thank you, Jess. Okay, so next slide. I think we want to do the same thing here. So this is the actual exchange where the collection would happen, and this is also where we had kind of our sidebar conversation about monitoring versus collection too, which might not be this first spike, but is a question that we have to also, I think, talk to with regard to that flow. And how do these two slides actually differ? Can you go back to endpoint repository and collector? So, this is the collector providing information back to the endpoint repository, and then the next slide is the. Oh, okay, so this is actually the one that I was talking to before. So this is where the target endpoint is having information be collected and where it's providing that collected information back to the collector.
Yeah, this is saying that actually these two slides differentiate the tasks that use vulnerability data and information. So the data is the first slide, how to get it, how to update the collector, how to basically do this stuff, and this is the get stuff. Am I right? Or I'm not understanding.
Well, let's talk in more concrete terms. So I believe this is the collector asking for things like, give me your software load.
Yeah. Okay. So, but he already knows how to do this.
And this is the endpoint responding back with, this is my software load.
Okay. Could you show me the slide before again? Maybe I'm not.
And then this.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And then this is this is the part that I think
Yeah.
we said we weren't going to do because the endpoint repository isn't going to
Yeah.
interact with the collector.
Also, I'm bad at reading, so I just didn't read the terms at the top right. So,
But this arrow here is the part where the collector is publishing the information that is collected on the next slide to the endpoint repository. Correct? Okay. So again, we need to talk about, I use the example of, this is my software load. That's one type of information element. We need to drive some more conversation about what other information elements need to be exchanged here. One could say that you need to exchange identifying information about the endpoint so that you know which endpoint had that software load. But that's something for conversation. Next slide, please. So the other thing that we talked about at the last IETF was that that we need to, in order to promote more development of solutions, that we need to, start cobbling together a proof of concept implementation of this stuff. We have a number of existing solutions across a number of older and current IETF efforts to include the work in NIA, the SWIMA draft that we've been working on here. There's the OVAL work, which was committed to the working group, but contributed to the working group, but we haven't done anything with. There's a wealth of work in the NetConf area, which Kent talked about earlier. The Yang push stuff could also be something that we could do some experimenting with. Are there any folks here that would be interested in working on developing some proof of concept that would implement this workflow? One idea is that we could organize an effort for the next hackathon to do some work before the event, and then to get together and actually work on building something that represents this workflow to see to start evaluating some of the decisions and ideas that we have. Hank?
yeah, exactly. This is Hank again. So I was talking with Eric White about the Yang event notification stuff, and he's committed to find out how this would interface with Sacm. So that would be a collection method. Also, I was talking to the CDNS guys, that ICANN authors that released a draft about analyzing DNS traffic. So what they do is aggregate DNS PDU flow data, batch it up, annotate it with metadata in order to be assessed for anomalies and malicious behavior. So this is a super use case. They already have metadata, they already have an aggregation function. We could place it in our architecture and see how this works, because they have actually done all the functions in code. They have not released it yet, but there's a good chance. Also, they are somehow really interested in this work and how to compose, how to contribute to the bigger picture with their effort. And they were very enthusiastic that so many people were paying attention to their work. They have a very good approach. They're very founded and grounded, and I'm very happy that they agreed to listen to me, and committed to, we will swamp in and maybe join at a hackathon, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Stephen Banghart, just quick clarification. Hank, that code that they were writing, was that related to Yang push, or is that something different? I just didn't catch that, sorry.
No, actually, the Yang push stuff, the Yang event notification, I don't know if this is Yang push, but the Yang event notification stuff is independent from that. But Eric was very open to encodings that would facilitate a specific work group. Yeah. So, no, that's different.
So
In that case, really quick, the people who are knowledgeable about Yang push, what is the status of any kind of implementation there? Is there anything that people are working on as a prototype or anything like that, or is it still too early for that?
So I'm not actively working on it myself. This can't from Juniper Networks. But Eric Voigt's team in Cisco is working on it. They have an implementation.
Is that going to be an open source implementation?
I don't know.
We could reach out to them. Yeah, so I think would it be useful to maybe start a discussion on the list about who might contribute what components to to a future hackathon event?
I think that would be useful. Is it possible to have a subset of what you want to try so that people could identify the components that fit into that subset, or as opposed to a completely open-ended question? So
Right. Well,
so we want to do this piece of the
vulnerability assessment scenario.
right. We want to do this piece of it, and we think these pieces would be, here's a proposed logical breakdown of what how these pieces would come together, and who might do those pieces.
Yeah, and I think that would be bounded somewhat by where we have existing code that we could that we could leverage. And I'm not sure where. So Hank mentioned some stuff. Eric has some stuff. I know we've worked on. We've got a reference implementation of Rolly that we could use for the BDD piece.
Alternatively, maybe another way to do this would be to initiate a conversation on the mailing list about we are, as opposed to defining the scope and asking which components. Perhaps the way to do it would be to say we're thinking we would like to do some Sacm work at the next hackathon, and then have a discussion on the mailing list about scoping it, which I think might actually be another way of saying what you were originally saying.
Yes.
Who can contribute which pieces?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
I
I'm-
actually like your original idea better. Ignore my second idea.
And I'll volunteer to do that. Have that conversation.
I think part of what I really like the idea of doing something in a hackathon. I think part of what this effort was trying to do was to get people thinking more concretely, and there's nothing to get them thinking concretely like actually making things work.
Doing something concrete.
Doing something concrete helps the concreteness. Well, it's also deadlines and hands-on. Both of those will help with.
Running code would help. My question in this context is, there was this phase staging introduced by Danny, and it included, or basically it excluded some functions. And I think one of the questions to be raised on the list is this a phase one step that excludes explicitly some things, or are we free to use and try to plug fast everything?
My gut is to say that for this hackathon experiment, that we should do as much as people are able to do.
Okay, because we had the staging thing, and it was literally about implementing stuff. So maybe at the specific hackathon, we loosen up a little bit and do not think about these phases. I don't know. We have to agree on this, I think, in order to know what scope this is. And this is going as a contribution to the discussion which is to be raised.
I don't think we need to agree on the hackathon scope today. I think this is it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any other discussion on hackathon thoughts? Next slide. So next steps. So today we've talked through the components, the interactions, a number of tasks. We've identified a number of issues, I think, that we need to work on. We've talked about needing to get some discussion going on the list in some specific areas, which we'll organize and do. Hank, you had mentioned that you were going to work on syncing up some of the stuff that you had in terminology in the wiki. We need more help with fleshing out the content in the wiki. If you're interested, please speak up on the list. Were there other next steps that I missed? This slide seems like it should have been at the beginning of the. These might be backup slides, or yeah, they might be. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think this. Okay. Go ahead, Kathleen. Well, does anybody have any more? Well, Dave, thank you very much. I know you were thrown into this.
You're welcome.
Kathleen Moriarty, just a quick note. I think it would have helped to not have it described as a scenario on the agenda, because that's a draft that has gone all the way through working group last call, but this really was more of next steps after that, right? So it's building it out. So it's
all right. Yeah,
right?
This was
because I didn't
right.
I wasn't feeling too bad about being late, but because I had to be, so sorry about that. But
yeah, no,
it's different than what the agenda said. More.
Right. It was a fleshing out of a scenario to help us try and get focus on the architecture. To help us.
Next steps.
Right.
Yep.
So
yep.
that it's
And yeah, so just the impression to other people too that might have.
Yeah, that's true. All right. So the more I think about it, the more I think that hackathon is our last best hope. No, a good idea as opposed to last best hope. All right. Hank? Hank?
That's because he just sent it.
How are we in time? I didn't look at that. Hi, I'm Henk Burkhardt from the Fraunhofer Institute, and I'm giving some insight on two drafts in one slide set, because my two presentations are basically next to each other. So first of all, I will talk about the current concise software identifier draft, and after that, terminology. Next slide, click. So we were just a quick recap. Concise software identifiers are basically ISO SWID tags, but those are in XML. The freely available XSD from ISO is basically huge. It also includes some interesting way to provide extensibility by using any attributes and Alex checking on other namespaces, for example. So yeah, it can be used in multiple ways. So we added a specific usage of software identifiers, which everybody wants to use them for, but it's kind of difficult because signing of the actual XML SWIDs is a little bit underspecified. So we specifically specified how to sign those. So as in consequence, they can be used as reference integrity measurements provided by the vendor of software accompanying the software. So they're signed by the vendor, provided by the vendor, and probably one way to provide them is the ROLI mechanism with the software description extension. So we are exploring that route actually right now. Also, just to give a little bit of background, the semantic scope of a tag, a software tag, is to be in a file system. A document in the file system is installed in combination with software. So paths to files that are represented in the SWIT tag are relative to the location of the SWIT tag document in the file system, which is all fine and good. So first of all, a piece of software, like Minesweeper is my example here, and a PDF reader require two separate SWIT tag documents because they are two separate semantically distinguishable software pieces, components in our terminology. So the scope is a piece of software, and we did now add something that addresses a space in between, because there are pieces of software that are not in a file system but kind of important, which are typically called firmware. So these are on block devices, and there's no way to store a SWIT tag in the file system where the block device is. There's literally no way to combine those. So we added a fifth experimental resource collection type to the SWIT tag, which is the firmware. And this is including standard attributes about firmware, which are already defined in RFC 4108. So we use terminology from there. And also, and this is basically exhausting the limits of the semantics of the SWIT tag, we provide the option to include the actual blob of firmware in the SWIT tag, which might not be feasible with the Office suite, because it's kind of really big. But firmware actually is not so huge. And this would enable a SWIT tag to become a container for the actual firmware, all its metadata that is required to be applied and to be signed or even encrypted by the vendor, which is, again, it is allowed. If you look at the ISO specification, read through it, it is not disallowed, but it is a very specific usage that is probably not foreseen by the authors of the SWIT ISO document. And I'm highlighting this here because it should be bashed hard.
Dave Waltermeyer, one of the co-authors on the draft. I want to apologize to Hank because I disappeared on working on this draft for a little while for health reasons. So this ended up getting submitted without looking at it. I'm not against doing something like this in the draft. One of the things that was one of my personal goals for this draft was to keep parity with the ISO SWID specification as much as possible, so that we effectively had an equivalency between in semantics between CoSWID and the ISO SWID tag. By adding some of these extensions, which I think are useful, we are breaking that parity. So I think.
First of all, let me interject. We are not, because they littered any attributes everywhere. So it's still interoperable,
Sure.
but not validatable on the XML side.
Well, so some of the parity that I was hoping that we would have in CoSWID is that we would expose similar kinds of extension points in CoSWID. So
Yeah.
definitely in agreement there. I think we just have to we're going to have to add some text to this draft to talk about where there is parity with the ISO SWID tag specification, semantic parity, and where there's not.
Yeah.
And so for this new stuff, which we might want to think about adding to a future revision of the ISO SWID tag specification, we need to figure out how we're going to treat those as extensions within the document or as separate documents. I'm open to exploring a number of different paths.
Both is very possible, and you're bringing up a very good point. We want to define better define extension points here. And the language used to express the CoSWIDs actually have an excellent mechanism for this. So yeah, we have, but the first decision is where to put extension points that deviate in strong definition from the freely provided XSD, so that it is still an identical core, and then give probably in other sections or other drafts extensions to these extension points, which is a totally viable way to move forward. And you're correct. This is just because I had to put it in somewhere, actually in
Sure.
the complete set, but you can as easily put an extension point there, make a type choice out of the resource collection types, and then extend that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it makes sense. Get the ideas down on paper, and then we can talk about what's the best way to organize them.
And also the list of attributes that is coming from 4108 is just a representative set. This is not a final set of attributes that might be interesting to people that want to convey information about firmware. It's just what I deemed, and there's some discussion with Jessica and some other MITRE guys, were deeming interesting. But there is more, there can be more, there can be less, something else. So this has to be refined. But it is something to look at, and you can already generate today, and there's code to generate SIBO, of course, and then, yeah, you can play with that, even probably at a hackathon or something. So next slide, please. If there's any questions, no more questions. No. Okay. So yeah, I wanted to highlight a specific decision, preliminary decision. John Stressner and I talked about how terminology drafts work a lot. And we included a lot of people that provide to the drafts in this discussion. And for I2NSF, the terminology draft is a steering tool. Decisions are made there first and then are implemented in other drafts. So it is actually a place where the concept is introduced and then is adopted by management framework or information model. So they want to get that stable fast because the other drafts will not proceed as fast if they do not stabilize that draft. I think with Sacm we are doing it for traditionally the other way around. We check for consistencies or inconsistencies and resolve them and agree upon them in the terminology draft. But this does not basically is a dependency for other draft authors to always look at the terminology, as they should, and look if they are inconsistent with the current definitions, but it is not the place they have always looked to where they monitor or poll basically all the time to find the new definitions and new ideas and then implement them in their draft. Write them or include them into the draft. So we decided on, as a small group, and maybe I want to bring this to the bigger group and then to the list, is that the terminology draft for Sacm will remain open at least until the the information model and the architecture are basically last call and done. Because then our core terminology is stable, and then we can finalize the Sacm terminology draft. If there are objections to this in this room, please highlight them, because I would know why. And maybe we're making an error here, but I think we are more like making sure as an afterthought and as a reactive process that everything is consistent. And we do not want to stop improvement and development by having to check with the terminology authors all the time. I think that's not the way to go.
Dave Woltermeyer, just to highlight on that, I think it's useful to have common terminology across all of these efforts because they're fairly related. I think we just have to move. I think it's great that folks are willing to sign up on a list to try to negotiate some of that out. I just think we need to move forward with an abundance of caution because we don't want to be bound by terminology. We don't want terminology to get in the way. We don't want to have to get the approval of this new group in order to make progress in any one working group.
Okay, I'm talking only about Sacm at the moment. I'm not talking about cross-group. I'm talking about the Sacm terminology document, and this is exactly what you just said. No approval process, documentation process, and resolving inconsistencies. Just not like it is in I2NSF where policy rules, for example, were defined first. Now they go into the management framework, and then they go into the complete set of documents in I2NSF. So this is the other way around, basically. And that's why in I2NSF they can close it at some point, I think, because it is a good steering tool for consolidating their architecture for that. We make sure that they do not close the last call with something that's totally inconsistent with ours. So that's the first thing I wanted to highlight here and to get comments on. The second thing is that a lot of people I talked to, basically everyone involved in the terminology about events and attestation, which is the top, bottom of this slide, like Eric and Phil and Dirk from the SEC event, or ID event, or whatever you want to call it. Like Huawei, Frank just left the room. And Diego from I2NSF, John from I2NSF, and Nancy was always kind of stressed out when we change terms again. And so she's the sanity check. We agreed that talking about terminology, it might, in all the different workgroup lists, might decrease visibility. So Dirk Hart actually said, don't just create a single mail list for all the terms that are in dispute across work groups, and we resolve it there. And they all promised to propagate that list in the appropriate work groups and maybe across. There will, of course, be, and then if it would be approved, IETF announced, but I'm not sure how many people are reading that. And so we have also identified 2 initial tasks that really have to be worked around, which is event, because after sitting in with the security event guys, they have a totally different understanding than Eric, for example, has of event notification. It's literally not the same thing. So both are valid, and we have to somehow find a map and place people where they are, what the dimensions of semantics are, or the content of a message actually, what is inside, what is implied by it. Some people think an event is a command, literally. So so we have to find all this interpretation, where they're used, how they're used, where are you, and then you can always find yourself in the realm of IETF and beyond that, probably. Beyond, especially for attestation, because attestation is used at least at global platform a lot, and also in the trusted computing group. It started to be used in the IETF, and also there already inconsistently. We had some idea of attestation in TEEP, and some of that in an I2NSF, and some of them in token binding, and the token binding got bashed hard. So there's another need. So I also talked to all the attestation authors that are not on this list, and they basically all said, yeah, this is a mess, we have to somehow resolve this. And Dirk was actually, I wrote his name. This is not Drick, but Dirk, sorry. He was the one, the loudest voice that said, you have to fix this now, do an email list now, we have to get rid of the problems now. So I wanted to highlight this, and I wanted to ask the room if there's support for this, or there's something that's speaking against it, and maybe Kathleen has an opinion about this, I don't know. Yeah, well, yes, those are. I know Bob has something to say, but he's not even listening to me. Yeah. Okay, yeah, we could also do it on list, but I think the room, I think it's important to say.
Yeah.
What this Connor pro.
Since we're here, you might as well go to the mic.
A definition of identity, what you're talking about, the object is, in my view, a critical thing that you have to have, and the whole terminology. Terminologies tend to be focused on a particular effort, so you do get specific definitions which seem to be a little bit different than in other areas, but that's okay because you're typically the subset of those things. So yes, we do it, yeah.
And the idea also includes a kind of umbrella definition, the general one, and that you can derive your specific ones from.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting and nice. I mean, I really want some general definitions, but that's not Sacm's job to do necessarily. But if people want to know generally what we talked here, it gets squishy though at times, and making focused definitions here is worth the effort, because the big general stuff does get squishy, and people have lots of cases they like to make.
Okay, so identity. I have to ask what exactly you mean with that, an object, but yes, I can.
Yeah, there are objects. We have objects which are things, and objects which are processes.
Okay, and then the representation, yeah. Okay.
And what is it that we're trying to name, and why do we want to name it, and how, and so forth. So, I mean, I've been working in this area for 20 years, so I got a lot of bruises from it.
Yeah.
a lot of broken bones. But it's, here in Sacm, you are talking more of process objects that you're naming. And so what are the classes and the groupings of them and how you group them, and then and thus why, what do you hope to gain by naming them? And then what are the requirements and the focus on that naming? That all that comes into play.
Okay. I would like to highlight that a prerequisite to talk about a term is that you are not a single voice. So if there's just one voice that says this should be so, we cannot resolve the problem. So we have at least two people, two groups, two individuals, two ideas and concepts that have to conflict, and then we can try to resolve that conflict and reel other people in.
Yeah,
I think that's the purpose.
Elsewhere I'm working on a very general, squishy definition of naming objects. And that and I feel that that's really too general for Sacm.
Okay.
But it's where you can really look for generally what I look at as identity versus identifier.
Okay.
And the importance of why you need, and particularly Sacm needs identity and identifier. It's one of those areas that needs the two. And thus why you need the two for work going forward.
Okay. Have you ever talked about Max about identity with Max about identities? Because what he would have an opinion about that.
Max and I go way back on this, way back.
Okay.
But again,
sure.
he also has a fairly focused view on it.
Because
in my
you
highly
was
biased opinion, he also has a focus.
So that's
which is good.
Hey, guys,
which is good. Yeah, except we're moving on.
Perhaps.
Okay, maybe.
We're drifting.
Okay, sure. Okay, identifier. Got it.
Yeah, Joe Salaway. So the thing I'd be concerned about here is that if we may not be able to come agreement as to what particular terms mean, and we, the appropriate thing to do may be like, in this case, this group is using this term this way, and in this case, and as long as we know in each group how we're referring to. Now, some terms like may not be amenable to that, but many of them will be in that. It won't matter if we call this an event and they call that an event, as long as we know what context that term is being used. And I would be concerned if we try to unify terminology would be difficult.
No, it is not a glossary. This is very important. It's not a glossary, but a terminology. So there can be semantic context, and you can resolve them by pointing to each other. I think that's the purpose of this.
Yeah, Tony Nadlin, I would also support that. We don't want a unified set of definitions. If it's just pointing to the different definitions, I think that would be.
If they exist, that's a problem. If they're in evolvement, that it can be resolved.
No, if the definitions exist today in, over in ID, in SEC events or in OAuth or any of the other ones, they should be pointed to. They shouldn't be made to consolidate or point to a consolidated definition.
They don't exist.
Yeah.
So there is an existing one of event nobody wants to use.
To some extent, they do exist. We have definitions of events.
Yeah, of course. For example, the alarm information management thingy. And everybody I talk to you using event now is agreeing that this definition does not work.
Okay, so.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
And then I will.
Definitely.
Kathleen Moriarty, I guess it'd be good to put a bike shedding exercise off to a different mailing list, if, because this has the potential to do that.
Right.
I would be very careful. I'm fine with if there's enough interest to go ahead with that, but I think it's something that shouldn't hold up working groups. I just took a look at, there's an extensive definition for identity, for instance, already in RC 4949, and we've been using those for a long time. So, I'd be hard pressed to think that we have some problems with some of those core definitions.
Right. I think which I think might be what Tony Nadlin was saying as well. I think coordinating, understanding that there's terminology in different groups and a lightweight effort to keep that terminology consistent would be great. I think hashing out detailed definitions that are going to get used across is going to be really tough.
Yeah, some of it is already decided upon, so you cannot change that. Like 4949, it's working very well.
I think
Identity,
it's,
for example, is a good example. But identity is also evolving in the terms of tokens and claims and such. And so maybe we can add on to some of this and provide context for new work.
And that's
Right.
fine. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that make sure
and,
you're
and doing
doing
it
your
on another
research.
mailing list
Yeah.
is a great idea.
Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
we agree.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's me. That's done. That next slide is obligatory. Oh, I actually have something. We can skip that if you want. Do you have time? I don't know.
What do you need to skip?
Okay, I can just provide a small update. This is basically a definition that are required to provide our part in the discussion. So these are updated data provenance because the revised Yang data store draft has a definition of data origin. They already also have a fluent and not yet set in stone definition of configuration, dynamic configuration state and such. And everybody I spoke to from the security area was confused. And I highlighted this in the group, and they were really, they improved the terminology already, but the module that is basically then instantiating that in Yang did not include that improvement yet. And we agreed to talk and to sync, because data origin, and if we do the Yang event notification stuff, would be great for our use cases, because we already defined data source and data origin, and we could basically collect that data via that way. And then it would mean the same thing, that would be great. But at the moment, it basically doesn't. And so, but they were very receptive to the comments, and I think this can be also, healed. So that's about it.
Okay, thank you. Possibly. So a couple things. We have our regular way forward discussion. At the end of the meeting, if some of the key participants could stick around for a few minutes, we just wanted to have a really short conversation about planning going forward. So you know who you are, please stay. It'll only take a minute or two. Otherwise, I think we are, in a, we will have a couple of meetings between now and the next one. Let me ask this. How many people participated in the design meetings that were held between the last one and this one? There you go. Okay. That's a very wimpy hand, Bill. So we were thinking that the design meetings would be, they're open design meetings, obviously, but we thought they would be, we were thinking they would be a little bit more productive than the interim meetings that we've been having that were more like status updates on documents. Is there a preference one way or the other? No? No? All right. How many people here think they would be interested in participating in a hackathon? Okay. I see. Okay. See, we'll give you credit for 2 hands then.
Dave Boltermeyer, I suspect if we advertise that we're doing a hackathon, we might actually get some more folks interested from other groups.
Right. Part of what I'm trying to think through on the fly, which is always a dangerous thing to do, is what we think the next steps are. And it seems to me that for the next couple months, really focusing on scoping, designing and scoping a hackathon might be the best next step for us. Kathleen?
Kathleen Moriarty. So maybe also talk to the folks from I2NSF who were able to pull in a university to do coding, right? So they have continued participation at this meeting too. So, I don't know what opportunities there would be because you might have to go local there. but
Okay. So look for information on a couple of interim discussions that will be scoped as you see them on the mailing list. I'm not exactly sure what to call them at this moment. Design meetings, hackathon design meetings, interim meetings, something like that. Informal meetings between now and then. Otherwise, I know there was a number of things, number of discussions. We said we wanted to continue on the mail, or we wanted to start or continue on the mailing list, and go ahead and take those up. And other than that, does anybody else comments, questions, inappropriate remarks? Nope. Okay. Anyway, if some of the key protagonists could stick around, we'd like just a couple minute offline conversation. You know who you are. Please come. And Joe, since I see you at the back of the room, can you stick around as well?